Okay, so I've been struggling a little bit about being able to put all this together because really it could take me like an hour and a half to really go through it in the way that I feel like it would truly do its justice. So forgive me if I kind of skip over some things. I just want to point out the things that I find to be the most important in the takeaways, as well as I also have some references on here, as well as a sheet that if anyone wants the PowerPoint that I can provide it as well. Okay, so just an introduction to the study. Just a little bit about body image. When people think about it, they tend to look at it as a like lesser sense, like something that okay, well, if we talk about body image, it's not as important as other things in mental health. However, through my research, I found that there's a strong connection between body image, health, and eating. Also, the way that someone feels about their body image can impact their everyday life, like their thoughts, their behaviors, and how they interact in different relationships. Particularly with African American community in general, culture is something that's discussed, but it's primarily discussed in terms of it being like a protective factor, but not really talking about how culture can impact their body image in other ways. So just in general, the statement of the problem, body image perception can contribute to some issues in terms of eating disorders. It can also impact people's self-esteem and their mood, how they interact with others in their relationships. But in general, it's often presented in a way that doesn't take their African American women's experience into consideration. So the biggest takeaway is that it's important in terms of the statement of the problem to understand what African American women's body image experiences are, and then how these different factors are influencing or impacting their body image. So the purpose of the study was to look at these different socio-cultural factors and relational factors that I identified, as well as look at to have a better understanding of the conceptualization or the unique pressures that African American women face. Because within their own culture, there's certain standards and ideals, as well as outside of their culture, mainstream culture, there's a lot of different things that are thrown at them or ideals that are presented. And so really understanding both those experiences and what that's like for them, but also to expand on the lack of literature that addresses this. Even though my literature review, as you'll see in a few seconds, is very expansive, a lot of it had to do with using quantitative measures, but not actually using qualitative measures. I mean, sometimes it was used in terms of focus groups, but not individual interviews. So these are my two research questions. What are the social, cultural, and relational factors affecting the essence of body image experiences in African American women? And how are these social, cultural, and relational factors influential to their body image? So the significance of this study is really to educate counselors and the community about the following factors. The cultural standard of beauty in the African American community, because it's different. The social, cultural, relational factors that influence body image perception. The impact that these factors have on African American women's body image experiences. The body image concerns and risk factors that African American women may face, and how these factors can be influential to African American women's mental health. So the implications for counselors. The biggest thing that I'm going to talk about, because there's so many different points, is really addressing body image in the counseling experience. Often, when I looked in the literature, it focused on body image in relation to eating disorders, and particularly in terms of eating disorders, anorexia. Whereas there's other eating disorders, such as binge eating disorders, but it's not even just about that. Your body image and your mood can impact how you view yourself, so it can impact it can impact depression, for example. As for counselors, we have to consider what is the standard of beauty, like getting into their culture, understanding their perspective. But not only that, but also understanding that the impact that the counselor can have just by the way they look and their presentation. I found that even doing my interviews, that I was a tool in itself. So the way that I wore my hair one day impacted how honest someone was with me, versus whether I wore makeup. So just me being a tool and having that conversation. We talk about multicultural counseling often, but what we neglect to do is to say the person across from you is different in some facet. So actually having these conversations with your client. And just as a community, just understanding that beauty isn't just one ideal, in other communities it's viewed differently. And then understanding how that can impact someone who is thrown into a society where mainstream culture says that maybe blonde hair and blue eyes is acceptable, but then your own culture, it might be weighing more, or it might be more curvy. So taking into consideration that culture matters and having that dialogue with your client. See a lot of, it goes on and on. It's because of this woman right here. Okay. So review of the literature. I'm just going to talk about the overviews because my committee said that I had to take body image and everything in its entirety back to creation. So I'm not going to put you all through that. So you can blame her again for that. So the first thing is that body image is a multidimensional construct. Often we don't really talk about body image in terms of it being more than just about weight. It's about skin complexion. It's about hair. It's also about how someone, it's about shape and size. These are all different things that we often don't discuss in terms of body image. So what I found in the literature, I found a lot of focus on thinness and the Western standard of beauty. That women often undergo different dangerous, painful treatments to try to achieve a certain body image ideal. Also, that having a perfect thin body or that being the core of beauty isn't the same for every single culture. So I found as I went through the literature that there was a big focus for talking about skin color. So often in the African American community, a lighter complexion skin was often seen as a preference. So I found that when it took it back to even times of the historical value in terms of slavery, but it talked about that if you had a lighter skin complexion, that there were more advantages that came along with that. In terms of body size and type, that for African American women, it wasn't just about weight, it was actually about how you viewed yourself. So were you curvy? Did you look like a Coke bottle shape? Like those were the things that were coming up. There was a big focus of curviness and hips. And that's something that's often not really discussed when we're talking about body image. Hair was a huge thing that I'll talk about that came out throughout my interviews, but just that historically, someone having straighter hair was seen as more acceptable. In terms of socioeconomic factors, it was looking at environment impacting how someone viewed beauty. So the more money that you have, you can be able to acquire more different things, or you might be able to have surgeries, these types of things. Family, often the family impact the shape and development of someone's body image. Gender factors, it was just for African American women, African American men, there was a greater preference for a curvier woman, causing some African American women to feel pressure to have a larger body type. And just with mass media, that there was a lack of representation of a wide stream of beauty. And again, some more things in terms of racial and ethnic identity. The stronger someone's racial identity was, or they felt connected to it, the less likely they were to have body image dissatisfaction. And in terms of assessment concerns, originally I wanted to do a mixed methods, but unfortunately I wasn't able to do it because there are no assessment tools that actually ask questions that are relevant to African American women. It only focused on weight and looked at elements of eating disorders and not necessarily about hair or shape in a way that was positive, rather it only being looked at as a negative attribute. And then protective and risk factors. African American girls were more likely to be overweight than Caucasian women. African American women are a greater likelihood to have a hypertension and diabetes, and they're also a greater likelihood of having binge eating disorder. So now to the core of my research. So I use qualitative methods. The participants, I use three types of sampling. So I use a snowball sampling, criterion sampling, and a stratified purposeful sampling. So my criterion sample was just the criteria that the individuals had to meet in order to participate in the study. Next, I contacted individuals that were I viewed as experts or just individuals in the community at different universities to disseminate this study out to individuals. And then lastly, I use a stratified purposeful sampling, so that way if on one end maybe I only had high SES, I could actually go back and then purposely look for people who are lower SES, so that way I could have a wide range of individuals. So I recruited using flyers and emails and social events throughout the Washington, D.C. area, as well as in Maryland and Virginia. But the thing that was funny was it snowballed a little bit out of control and ended up getting across the nation. So I ended up having people in Florida, in the Midwest, in Arizona, just through contact and through one person giving it to the next, and it just turned into a bigger thing. I actually had to go and actually have my IRB modified, as well as add tools to be able to do face-to-face interviews using a video software, just because it turned into a bigger thing than I anticipated. So in terms of my criteria, it was ages 18 to 29 years of age. They had to identify themselves as African American or Black American, U.S. born citizens, and they were open to talking about body image and culture and their experience and their body image experiences, and agreed to an informed consent. And the mean age, after it was all said and done, was the age of 24. Most of them, it was split between 50-50, so half of them were students and the other half were just working in a job full time. So my methods and my procedures, so what made my position, so what made me really want to get into this? Well, first off, it was just my own personal body image experiences. I read the literature, and overall they said, well, African American women have a higher sense of body image satisfaction. And I thought, well, for myself, I didn't always feel that way. I always felt like I was torn between wanting to look like the standard in my own community. So that was someone who was thicker and curvier, and so wanting to gain weight. And actually, I did some mentoring of young Black women who often would talk about wanting to be thicker and wanting to do things, or what could they do to gain more weight, or what could they do to look a certain way. And so as I started listening to these things and I started looking at the research saying something different, I thought I wanted to be able to give them a voice and talk about their experience, because it's not there, especially because a lot of the research is comparative in nature. So it doesn't just look at or isolate African American women's experiences. It takes Caucasian women's experiences, and then it compares. And so it doesn't actually isolate what are the factors or what are the things that are important to this group of people. Rather, if you want to be thin, we're going to look at those attributes. And that lessens the experience of a group of women if you're not exploring what is important to them. Okay. So in terms of my philosophical assumptions that I use an ontological, which is what is the nature of reality. And that's just acknowledging that there's multiple realities because people have multiple different experiences. And so it's not putting everyone into a box and saying, this is a group of people, and you look at this overall thing and say, this is where they fit in. Rather, what is their experience? What is their multiple realities? And what are giving them a voice, essentially. And so term and research bias, well, I looked at it like I went into it thinking, well, there's societal pressure to achieve a curvy body type from my experiences, as well as I thought, well, I think media might have an impact on body image. In terms of my theoretical approach, I use a phenomenological study, and that just basically looks at a shared experience of a group of individuals. So the lens that I used was a critical race feminism lens to actually interpret my results. And I chose this theory because there were two ones I originally had looked at, which was critical race theory as well as feminism. But neither one of them actually addressed the core issues of African American women. So critical race theory is actually presented from the point of view of African American men and their experience, and feminism is often used to look at Caucasian women's experiences. But it doesn't actually fuse the two, because African American women's experiences are much different. And so this looked at women of color and what their experience are, how they often not only marginalized, but because they're people of color, their experience is often lessened. Okay, so now I'm on a tight end. Okay, so what I used was face-to-face, semi-structured interviews, and I ended up having a minimum of 15 participants. It ended up having 22 participants. I used the in vivo software. I use the in vivo software to group everything. And I'm going to just jump to the things because I'm being told I got to wrap it up. Okay, so the things, what I found to be important were some of these things. So the participants acknowledged that there's whitewashing of Black beauty, there's a pressure to be thick and curvy, There's a duality of pressures in terms of African American women feeling like they're torn between their own culture as well as the culture of other people. Social media impacted body image ideals and behaviors. Um, that overall body image for African American women is racially driven, that body image perception within the Black community is rarely ever discussed. But the one thing that came out of it that was positive was a diversity in Black beauty. So it ranges. So the biggest takeaway from this, and I had some memorable quotes and everything, but I won't get into them, was is that the greatest factors that impacted African American women's body image experiences were parents, particularly men. So having that connection and having parents actually talk about body image is something that is often not discussed. Is looked at in on the scale of things to have a conversation about, it's at the bottom. But yet I still have participants that often talked about, particularly one, trying to commit suicide 5 times because of feeling like she would never achieve a certain body image type. So as parents, the biggest takeaway is and counselors is talking about what can we do in terms of educating parents about having this conversation, teaching your child to openly talk about self-acceptance and love of yourself. So hopefully this research can actually go into not only creating like workshops and psychoeducational groups, but also creating the first assessment tool that actually considers African American women and their needs and their considerations. Yes. Um, I don't have them on me, but I can just give you some of the examples. But I looked at how do you define beauty, mainstream beauty, or what do you think is beautiful? Like, what do you consider to be beautiful? I also asked, how do you define the African American standard of beauty? I asked, does salary impact the way that you view your body image, or like what you could do differently? I also looked at what is the influence that family has had on your body image development. Like, what did people at school say about your body image growing up? What did people say about like your hair, your shape, your size? What did people say about your skin color? I also asked about what did intimate partners say? What did close relationships and friends say about body image or your experiences? So it just ranged. You know, what do you think, or how has media impacted your body image experience? And that included social media, television, music, so movies. And I broke each one down and asked them to elaborate and expand on each one. And so I will say too that was interesting. So my shortest interview was 30 minutes, and my longest was 3 hours. And I did the transcription. It was 52 pages, and it has been, I think, for me, one of the best experiences that I ever had to be able to connect and have people open up and let you into their world and be able to be vulnerable and to share their story. And I'm so grateful because I get to share with other people. Yes. So what I did find was that even though people who were in, I felt like it was an age gap, like um, thank you, sorry, tongue tied. I found that ones that were younger seemed to have a greater influence in terms of looking at like social media. So that was their reference point, and that was what was driving them. Whereas people who were older, in some ways, were acknowledging that talking, basically reflecting on when they were younger, and then talking about, well, I'm at a place now that I'm not as influenced by some of these factors. But I also felt like some people weren't being honest with me. I'm a counselor, so I was picking up on body language. I picked up on things that were being incongruent and inconsistent with what they were saying, like, oh, well, no, I don't have that problem anymore, but I still get mad about, this session. And so I said, well, that's something that's still you're working through. And I think people, if you poked at it, they would acknowledge it, but then they lessened it. And so really there was some differences, but I think that it was just the same common things that were coming up over and over across all ages. 18 to 29. But you know, and then the other thing that was great too was I actually had a lot of people who responded back to me that were in their 30s that said, "Well, how about you talk about our stuff because we're going through transitions." Or I even had people in their 40s who were saying, "Well, what about me?" And so you kind of, why couldn't you open it up? And I said, "Well, because somebody over here said that I had to narrow it down." Um, but I'm glad that I did because honestly, I was able to get 23 participants in less than 2 months, and I still have them coming in. And so I had to halt it because it was getting to the point that it actually was getting overwhelming, and because my minimum was 15, and I surpassed that because when it started to go to other states, we had to rail it back in because they wanted to get me out. The 18 to 29 range was considered emerging adulthood. And I did that just because it was critical. So it was you're coming out of adolescence in a way, still a little bit in that range. But there's just a lot of different transitions that you're going through. And so I thought to myself, this might be like a peak time where people are on their own. They're starting to have newfound relationships. Um, and so it was, I think, that transition where you're an adult, but not completely, or as you're going into about to go into adulthood. So I felt like that was a critical time for people going to college, coming out of college. People are getting married. So I just thought that that would be emerging adulthood is this point and a critical point in people's lives to really explore. And I wanted to do adolescence, but the idea of getting parental consent would just been way too complicated to be able to do it. And so having some people that were still in high school but 18 worked because I was able to still get into that window.